Hi, everyone. Welcome to part three of the three triads of One Health. Previously, you learned about the introduction to One Health by myself earlier last week, and my colleagues walked you through animal health as well as human health as One Health. Today, I'm going to talk about environmental health as it relates to One Health. You should remember me. My name is Phaedra Henley, and I'm the director of our Center for One Health at UGHE. I've also been trained in environmental science, and a lot of my previous research was looking at an ecosystem health approach to different communities at risk, but including, as you see here, I showed on my first session as well, Lake Naivasha in Kenya, where you can see the massive floriculture industry surrounding Lake Naivasha and the resultant changes of the ecosystem and the impacts you can see this has on animal health and human health, which we'll talk more uh, in depthly later in this session. So we'll just talk a bit through a review of what One Health is. So by now, at the end of these 2 weeks, you should be an expert in what One Health is. But just as a reminder, it's a collaborative, multi-sectoral and transdisciplinary approach working at the local, regional, and national and global levels with a goal of achieving optimal health outcomes, recognizing the interconnection between people, animals, plants, and their shared environment. So our intention for the last 2 weeks was to introduce you to One Health, as well as tease out these different components of One Health and how they fit into the broader approach. And again, these are the 6 principles that typically define a One Health approach. And you should have got these in more detail in the first session. Knowledge to action, stakeholder analysis, transdisciplinarity, sustainability, systems thinking, and participatory. Again, you'll have office hours next week, where if you have any questions about One Health or these 6 principles, we'll be there to answer them. So now we're going to take a bit of a deeper dive, as I mentioned, into environmental health. So before we can continue, there are some basic terminologies to understand in order to understand and appreciate the massive role our ecosystems play in our lives. An ecosystem can be defined as a dynamic complex of plant, animal, and microorganism communities, as well as the non-living environment acting as a functional unit together. The living and physical components are linked together through nutrient cycles and energy flows. Ecosystems can be typically of any size, but usually they are in particular geographic places. So you would have read about some of these ecosystem services in the Lancet paper, but let's quickly review them. The benefits provided by ecosystems that contribute to making human life both possible and worth living. So examples of ecosystem services include provisioning services such as food and clean water, as well as wood and fiber and fuel, as well as medicines and new compounds. There are regulating services such as climate regulation, flood regulation, water regulation. So these are other services that the ecosystem provides. There are also cultural services, aesthetic, recreational, or spiritual. Our ecosystems do more than just providing us clean water and clean air, but it's very important for many cultures and for many spiritual benefits as well. Lastly, there are also supporting services or habitat services, and we've talked about some of these in the introduction to One Health, such as biodiversity or genetic diversity, maintenance of habitats, but also includes soil, which is really important in our ecosystems, and photosynthesis. So you can see from this slide that the functions that ecosystems provide are essential to attaining and maintaining good human health. Many of the Wicked One Health problems that we saw in the introduction, as well as through Dr. Ursa and Dr. Yana's presentation, have been caused by rapid transformations of our global environment. There have been massive disruptions in ecosystem functions, which support our development as human beings. So seen here are some graphs of global trends in population, in consumption, health, and the environment. And again, you would have read about some of these in the Lancet paper, which goes into more details about the individual components. So the population today is the highest it's been. It's approaching almost 8 billion now. But poverty has also the lowest it's ever been, and life expectancy is the highest. So these seemingly, increases in good health, um, and that human health seems to be today better than any other time in history. We can also see this is paired with increased energy use, increased water use, as well as inland transformed for agriculture. So you can see that this great progress of the lowest levels of poverty and highest levels of life expectancy, that this progress has been supported by the Earth's ecological and biophysical systems. Alongside the development of public health, the development of agriculture and industry have been major drivers of human success, harnessing the Earth's ability to provide sustenance, shelter, and energy, which underpins the expansion of civilization. To achieve these great gains in nutrition, health, and energy, to reach 8 billion people, has required substantial changes in our ecological and biophysical systems, which often impacts their functions, such as the services we've just discussed, the ecosystem services. And these are things that we rely upon as well for good health. So in essence, you can see that humanity has traded off many of the Earth's supportive and regulating processes to both feed and fuel human population growth and development. A simple way to look at the causes of environmental degradation is what's called the IPAT model of growth, which was proposed in 95. So this is looking at the environmental degradation of human origin stems from three major interacting sources. So the impact, I, is caused by population size, the level of consumption or affluence, A, and the damage to the ecosystem caused by T, technologies used to supply the consumable products and to support a given lifestyle. So while the validity of expressing environmental impact is a simple product of independent factors, and that these factors should be included in their comparative importance, has been a subject of debate among environmentalists. In particular, some have drawn attention to the interrelationship between the three factors, and other people have said that they wish to stress other factors that are not included in this model, such as political and social structures in the scope for beneficial environmental actions. But in this context, I think for us, it provides a simple way to think about the drivers of environmental change. And this was also discussed in the Lancet paper. So we'll just go through the three different parts that create the IPAT model and the level of environmental degradation, with the world population as of about a month ago is almost 7.7 billion people. But it's not just about this number, it's about how much resources does each person consume, and how much resources is remaining. Affluence, or the level of consumption, um, it represents the average consumption of each person in the population, and as the consumption of each person increases, the total environmental impact increases as well. So it's not just, what people are using, but what needs to go in to ensure that um, the product is made, for example, the resources, fuel, all of the environmental resources that go into making the demands of the population. And this level of consumption relates directly to the Earth's supply. And you can see here, this is a map by World Mapper, that shows the ecological, or the consumption footprint of different countries around the world. It gives a picture of each country's and each person's total ecological footprint. And the ecological footprint has been established as a measure to quantify humanity's impact on the natural environment. And it's calculated by estimating the carrying capacity of the natural environment and comparing this to levels of consumption and to waste. The ecological footprint then allows us to put the actual global hectares that are consumed and wasted into the context of existing biocapacity. So a sustainable world needs an average ecological footprint of 1.63, and that's seen here in green. And you can see from the map, which shows the extent to which countries overuse the world's natural resources, with increasing numbers in red, into darker red. So as it stands now, 500 million people on the planet, about 7% of the world's population is responsible for 50% of all carbon dioxide emissions. At the other end of the scale, the bottom 3 billion people are responsible for just 6% of the total. The United States leads the world with its 5% of the world population, roughly responsible for 1/3 of all global expenditures on goods and services. So you can see that there's, massive inequity in who is using the resources, and then who is the recipient of a lot of the challenges, human health challenges, from this changing environment. So technology is the last component, and this represents how resource intensive the production of affluence is, and how much environmental impact is involved in creating, transporting, and disposing of goods and services and amenities used. Improvements in efficiency can reduce the resource intensiveness and reduce this T multiplier. Technologies define the magnitude of environmental impact resulting from the pursuit of a particular level of affluence for a given population size. Technological development has underpinned humanity's exploitation of the environment and has made possible human progress across all key sectors of the economy. Many technological advances do increase resource use efficiency, but frequently this does not result in an overall reduction of environmental footprint, because these efficiency gains stimulate consumption either directly or indirectly through increasing disposable income, which can fuel the purchasing of additional goals. With a video that I'll send you from overfishing, you saw You will see that here on the left, this is mapping in order to catch fish into the deeper ocean. So this technology has allowed fishermen to go deeper into the ocean, farther in and deeper to be able to catch more fish. Relatedly, on the right, this is a shark fin soup. So the lifestyle and the prestige of eating shark fin soup also increases overfishing of sharks and degrading the environment. So what are the consequences of our actions and the damages to the ecosystem? We saw from the introduction to One Health and a lot of the challenges that we're living through right now are the end result of this, our actions of the increase in population, our ecological footprint, as well as our level of affluence, has caused massive damages to ecosystems, such as deforestation, you'll see here, air pollution, the bleaching of the coral reefs, and oil spills, which in turn are coming back to cause human health impacts on us. So you would have watched a video about a safe operating space for humanity, which is a concept developed at a sustainability center, which used tons of data in order to quantify the limits of, as well as where we currently stand of ecosystem processes. So this planetary boundaries framework identifies these biological and physical processes and systems important to the maintenance of Earth's functions that human beings rely upon to grow and flourish, or what is known as the safe operating space. Substantial changes in these systems could produce rapid, non-linear, and potentially irreversible changes in the Earth's environment that could create disadvantages to human development and health. So here you can see the 9 planetary boundaries and where we currently stand. The green space is the safe operating space. The yellow represents the zone of uncertainty, which is an increasing risk, and the red is a high risk zone. The planetary boundary itself lies at the intersection of the green and the yellow line. So you can see here for some of these, for some of these boundaries, we've surpassed the safe operating space, such as biochemical flows with nitrogen and phosphorus entering the environment, as well as genetic diversity or biodiversity loss, which we learned about in the first session. Some of them are approaching or have just passed what is known as the safe operating space, with climate change, which is massively increasing, land system change, as well as freshwater use. So now I'm going to dive a bit deeper into one of the wicked problems that we talked about, which is pollution. And I'm going to use mercury as an example of pollution to demonstrate environmental health as human health. So exposure to mercury threatens our health, with many often irreversible toxic effects. Developing fetuses and young children are most at risk. Mercury pollution also harms wildlife and ecosystems. Mercury occurs naturally in the Earth's crust, but human activities such as mining and fossil fuel combustion have led to widespread global mercury pollution. Most human exposure to mercury is from eating fish and shellfish contaminated with methyl mercury. Almost all people in the world have at least trace amounts of methyl mercury in their tissues, reflecting its pervasive presence in the environment. Mercury emissions have no national or continental boundaries, and mercury emitted into the air can travel thousands of miles in the atmosphere before it eventually gets deposited back into the earth in rainfall or dry form. I'm going to walk you through a couple examples of the impacts mercury has had. And as a Canadian, I need to talk about our Aboriginal communities in Canada, as well as the really poor history of how Canadians and the government of Canada have treated our Aboriginal communities, including First Nations groups. And we can see this strongly through this example of mercury contamination. So First Nations in Canada often, live off the land. There's a strong tie to the environment. Um, and in this community in Canada, a First Nations community called Grassy Narrows, um, in the 60s or 70s, there was massive industrial pollution, which contaminated their water source. And it's made it Canada's worst environmental disaster. 60% of the population in Grassy Narrows experiences symptoms of mercury poisoning, which includes neurological problems ranging from numbness in their fingers and toes to seizures and cognitive delays, according to a recent study. Then there's also the psychosocial stress of seeing your friends and family stricken with these health problems. So during the 70s and the 60s and the early 70s, a chemical plant in Dryden, Ontario, which is upstream of Grassy Narrows, dumped 9,000 kilograms of mercury into the river. The fish in the river were full of poison, full of mercury, and the people from Grassy Narrows who relied upon the fish as a staple in their diet now got exposed to mercury. Ontario, the province, then closed the commercial fishery due to this contamination. And the lucrative fishing tourism industry near Grassy Narrows also crashed as a result of this poisoning, resulting in mass unemployment. All of this came shortly after the community was relocated to a reserve, lured by the promise of better services such as clean drinking water, which is ironic now that their drinking water is no longer clean. And to date, there is still no safe tap water in most homes in Grassy Narrows. Almost half a century after mercury dumping began, as I mentioned, a study found that almost 60% of the residents were showing signs of mercury poisoning in Grassy Narrows. So there have been many battles, both private and public, during these decades of contamination of Grassy Narrows. So community members are starting to fight back against the government of Canada, asking for reparations and asking for the environment to be cleaned up and for clean drinking water. So further talking about mercury is transgenerational, we can call it. Once it's ingested, it never really goes away. And that's why you can see the impacts in Grassy Narrows are still ongoing today. Some important terms in order to understand this more are bioaccumulation as well as biomagnification. Bioaccumulation is the gradual accumulation of substances such as pesticides or other chemicals in an organism. Bioaccumulation occurs when an organism absorbs a substance at a rate faster than that at which the substance is lost by excretion or catabolism. Thus, the longer the biological half-life of a toxic substance, which mercury has a long toxic half-life, the greater the risk of chronic poisoning. So the longer it takes for the substance to leave the organism, even if the levels in the environment are not very high. So this often occurs in fatty tissue where contaminants can become mobilized and then can only be released with breakdown. Whereas biomagnification refers to the increased concentration of a toxic chemical the higher an animal is up on the food chain. So at grassy narrows, the example we just talked about, consumption of fish continues in the area, particularly a type of fish called walleye, which is a local favorite, but it is high up on the food chain and therefore contains high levels of mercury. Walleye remains dangerous for those with long-term exposure to the consumption of fish, such as walleye, because it contains approximately 13 to 15 times the recommended levels of mercury. And showing this example here, walleye, because it's higher up on the food chain, has higher levels of mercury as it's consuming species that are lower down in the food chain, but also contain levels of mercury. So we talked a little bit about climate change during our Introduction to One Health lecture. And we already know that the thawing Arctic permafrost would release powerful greenhouse gases, but it's also seen that the melting of the permafrost could also release massive amounts of mercury, which, as I mentioned, is a potent neurotoxin and a threat to human health. This cycle could be scary enough, but they have shown that there's already massive amounts of mercury that is being released into the water as well as into the atmosphere. For many communities, exposure to mercury through fish consumption is an exemplary case of environmental racism. Groups that rely upon fishing for food, cultural identity, spiritual well-being, or economic prosperity are more vulnerable to mercury pollution. The vulnerability is heightened because sources and hotspots of mercury are found disproportionately in areas near communities of color, low-income and immigrant communities, and Indigenous people. Mercury has impacted the health, the culture, and the identity of local communities. Such communities are victims of environmental injustice because they have derived little or no benefit from the products and services of mercury-releasing industries, but they now bear the burden of the wastes that are left behind. Existing strategies for reducing mercury exposure are not always effective in communities at risk. Fish advisories that warn of health risks of eating contaminated fish, like we saw in the grassy narrows example, perpetuate environmental injustice. This shift in policy from risk reduction to risk avoidance places these communities in a lose-lose situation. Either eat fish and suffer the health effects from contaminants, or do not eat fish and suffer the health and cultural effects of losing a critical diet food. By allowing significant mercury contamination to remain in place while advising the population at risk to change their lifestyle, regulators are indirectly perpetuating discrimination against communities that attach different values to fish. Another issue of equity and contamination with mercury is the example of small-scale mining. So small-scale mining uses mercury, not uses mercury, but mercury and other dangerous chemicals are commonly used during artisanal gold mining. And mercury is used during the amalgamation process as a cheap way to collect small gold particles from sediment. Once mercury and gold are combined to create the amalgam, this is typically burnt with a blowtorch to separate the mercury from the gold. And since gold mines, these small-scale gold mines are almost always set up near rivers, These excess chemicals are distributed directly into waterways. Small-scale mining is an important socioeconomic sector for the rural poor in many low to middle income countries, as you can see in the map that shows the number of small scale miners globally, with a lot located in the lower hemisphere. And this is putting these populations that are reliant upon this industry at greater risk to mercury exposure. A last look at equity and contamination with mercury. As I mentioned, consumption of fish is the major route of exposure to methyl mercury. And so often mercury poisoning impacts communities reliant upon fish for survival. We saw that with the example in Grassy Narrows, as well as the groups in the fishermen in Lake Naivasha in Kenya. We see the example of fishing communities in the north, in the Arctic, again impacted by climate change with permafrost melting, releasing more mercury into the environment, putting these fishermen and their families at greater risk to mercury exposure. I mentioned a bit about the human health impacts of mercury exposure, which are both acute as well as long-term. So acute poisoning can cause the symptoms seen here: muscle weakness, poor coordination, trouble speaking at a low dose. At higher doses, it's much more dangerous, with paralysis, coma, and death even possible. We also saw the longer term impacts from the case in the First Nations group in Canada, with toxic effects transgenerationally on nervous systems, digestive systems, kidneys, eyes, and lungs. And there's a serious threat, the major risk to the development of children in utero, as mercury can pass to the developing child, as well as early in life. I mentioned that mercury is transgenerational, and you can see that with this process called epigenetics, and this is a field that's starting to link changes in the environment to transgenerational health impacts. So epigenetics is the study of heritable phenotype changes that do not involve alterations in the DNA sequence. So epigenetics most often involves changes that affect gene activity and expression. But the term can also used to describe any phenotypic change. So prenatal exposure to mercury, which, as I mentioned, is a known neurotoxic metal, is associated with lower cognitive performance during childhood. And there is a scientific study showing that this change is linked to an epigenetic disruption in a certain gene. And this could be the link between the mercury exposure and the cognitive performance in children later in life. Lastly, there are also animal health impacts on from mercury. So with mercury being able to be easily transported through the world, it impacts wildlife from the north and polar bears to frogs in the far south of the Gold, and to birds in between. Once mercury becomes embedded in the soil or water, it becomes methyl mercury that can easily be accumulated in fish, which not only harms the fish, but all other animals which consume it, including humans. So studies have shown that animals which have high levels of mercury have fewer offspring, They're often small and slow to mature. They're slower to respond to predators, and overall, there's a decline in general fitness. As just a aside, there are many different factors that determine the impacts of mercury on health, such as the chemical form, the dose duration, route of exposure, age of the person or animal, or health of the exposed person or animal. So it's not so straightforward, but there are many different factors that go into determining the health impacts of mercury. So we saw that this example of looking at mercury as a pollutant, um, as an example of environmental health as one health, and how it has massive impacts through the environment, through human health as well as animal health. And I thought it gave, a good example to showcase some of the important concepts in One Health, such as environmental racism and injustice, as well as highlighting some of the inequities of these wicked problems. So that's the end of today's lecture. I hope you enjoyed learning about One Health as well as the different triads of One Health throughout the past 2 weeks. And we look forward to further discussions during office hours as well as when you can join us on campus. Thank you.